Hello, everyone. Today we are going to start our conversation on evolution or how these populations change over time. Today we're going to focus on early Earth and what the conditions were like millions and billions of years ago on our planet, um, and how those conditions have changed to allow for what we know of as life today. So, just a reminder on those characteristics that living things share. There were seven. All living things maintain order. We organize atoms and molecules into organelles and cells. Cells are the smallest unit of life, and those can be arranged into tissues, organs, organ systems, and on into organisms, which can then come together into populations, communities, ecosystems, and then the biosphere. And we also all maintain homeostasis. Our cells and bodies try to maintain an internal environment compared to what's going on outside. So try to stay in the same state regardless of external conditions. All living things process energy. Remember photosynthesis and respiration. Those were our two main ways that organisms process energy. And then there are certain organisms that use chemosynthesis as well. So you can look back at those if you need to remember what they are. We're getting into adaptation, which is something populations do. Living things grow and develop. We don't start out the size we are today. That would have been very hard on our moms. All organisms respond to their environment in some way, and that kind of goes into what allows for this adaptation that we are going to see over time in populations and communities. And all living things are able to reproduce on their own. So that is why viruses are not considered to be alive, because they are not capable of reproduction outside of a cell. So those are the characteristics of life, and we are going to look at where those characteristics came from. So conditions that make life possible on this planet are liquid water. That is the number one thing that we look for on other planets, because that would also indicate that we have a moderate temperature range that could support life. We do need free oxygen. All living things that use aerobic respiration, which is most of the living things on the planet, need that oxygen in the atmosphere. We need sunlight for driving photosynthesis, which also in turn gives us that oxygen. Absence of toxic substances, we really need low pollution levels in our environment if we are to survive. Too many toxic substances will poison us. Same with absence of lethal radiation. If we can't filter these harmful rays coming from the sun, then we would not have life on this planet. So we can thank the magnetic field of our planet for helping us get rid of this lethal radiation that would otherwise come in from space. And we as a society really need to work on our pollution levels to maintain this absence of toxic substances. So, this is what scientists look for on other worlds when they're trying to figure out if a world is habitable. So, this is called the Goldilocks zone. You have a planet that is too close to the sun, it would be too hot. Water would not be able to form, it'd be destroyed. And if we're too far away, any water that you had would turn to ice and would be solid. So that would not support life. We need that free motion and liquid water to help move materials around. So the Goldilocks zone is when you are just right. You're in this hypothetical zone away from the star where the temperature is perfect for liquid water. So on early Earth, our temperatures were very high, so high that all the rock was just molten lava. So you think of it as a big liquid ball of rock. And being that it was liquid, the dense materials were able to move to the center of the planet, and the lighter ones were able to move to the outside. So we had these density gradients forming, and the iron and nickel were very heavy and sunk to the middle of the planet. So that's what gives us our iron and nickel core. And the inner core is solid, the outer core is liquid, and one spins faster than the other, generating our magnetic field. The magnetic field is what protects us from the sun's harmful rays and keeps our atmosphere from blowing away from the planet. And we see our magnetic field in the auroras, the aurora borealis, or the northern lights and southern lights in the aurora australis. Um, Now, if we think about this molten ball, eventually it's going to start to cool, and the outside is going to cool first, giving you that thin layer of crust. Beneath, we still have the molten rock, and we still have some of that molten rock today. Earth has definitely not cooled completely, and we see that with the volcanoes that we have left. But there were many volcanoes on early Earth releasing these gases as the planet cooled. So those gases include many things like water vapor. One thing it did not include was oxygen. We'll look at that here in just a minute. So the water vapor collects in the atmosphere much like it does today, only you're releasing a lot of it. And so we have torrential rains. Those rains, as they come back down to the planet, the water collects in the depressions formed by the cooling crust, and eventually we can get our oceans, very shallow oceans. Um, and then plate tectonics, we have, the Earth as we know it today. So remember I mentioned that oxygen was one of the gases that we were not releasing, and we did not have that until photosynthesis came along, where organisms were able to convert this light energy and carbon dioxide that was present on our planet and water into oxygen and glucose to support the rest of the food chain. So we have this little diagram here, hopefully reminding you of the equation of photosynthesis. And these are redwood trees, some of the largest trees in the world. And these were some very early types of trees that we had on the planet. We'll try to look at those sorts of adaptations a little later. In addition to water vapor, these are some of the other gases that volcanoes released on our planet. Methane, which has the chemical formula CH4, and actually is a potent greenhouse gas, has 23 times the global warming power as carbon dioxide. We just can control our production of methane a little bit more than we can carbon dioxide, and we don't produce as much of it. So you don't hear about it as often, but it is a powerful greenhouse gas. Hydrogen, which has the chemical formula H2, nitrogen, which is most of our atmosphere today and has the chemical formula N2, makes up about 78% of today's modern atmosphere. Ammonia with the chemical formula NH3, carbon dioxide CO2, and carbon monoxide, which is just CO. So these were the gases that formed the atmosphere on early Earth. And of course, we had our water vapor as well. So you can kind of see this picture giving you an idea of what early Earth would have looked like. Note that the one gas we don't see is oxygen. Again, we didn't have that until photosynthesis came around many millions and billions of years later. So today's atmosphere is much different than what we had on early Earth. We do have free oxygen as we have photosynthesis going on all the time. That oxygen makes up about 21% of our atmosphere, nitrogen making up about 78%, and these trace gases like carbon dioxide and many of your greenhouse gases make up the other 1%. So while it's not a lot of our atmosphere, these greenhouse gases, these trace elements up there do have a huge impact on our environment. We also have ozone, which is a little different than oxygen. Oxygen is O2, ozone is O3, and we have ozone in a thin little layer in the stratosphere, so high up in our atmosphere. And ozone acts as an umbrella for our planet in terms of keeping out the sun rays that are harmful to us, UV rays in particular. So ozone is like sunscreen or a lady's parasol for our planet. It keeps the UV rays out. And if that ozone were to be depleted, then we would see higher rates of sunburn, skin cancer, as we would be letting more UV radiation all the way down here to where we live. So ozone, super important to keep up there. And ozone has nothing to do with climate change. That's one thing I do want to mention here. Ozone, again, only has to do with UV radiation and has been depleted in the past using chlorofluorocarbons. Those were refrigerants and things that we found in aerosols like hairspray containers. Mostly America quit using those in the late 80s. So the ozone has actually started to replenish itself, and we're seeing the huge hole that we created in the ozone start to shrink. This is one environmental problem that humans have been able to tackle. So that gives us a little bit of hope. We do have a suitable temperature due to our atmosphere. And our early atmosphere, again, did not have these abilities. And a lot of the gases that were in high concentrations on early Earth would have been toxic to today's life. So things have changed a lot since then. So two researchers, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey, were very interested in how life could have began on this lifeless little ball that did not have the characteristics to support it. So they set up a model to show what early Earth looked like. Here we have our oceanic compartment, lots of salt water. They are applying heat to get the water to evaporate, and part of that water is going to go up here into the atmosphere. So we have H2O. We also have methane, carbon dioxide, hydrogen, ammonia, and nitrogen here in this atmospheric component. Again, these are the molecules that we would have seen collecting in the atmosphere due to those volcanic eruptions. Then we run an electric spark through this atmospheric component, and that's to resemble a lightning storm. Now, the water vapor is going to condense, fall back down as rain, and this spark is going to allow some chemical reactions to go on while all this is happening. So they are collecting this rain here, in this beaker. And after about a week, they start noticing this beaker turn black. Now, Miller and Urey were not looking for cells. That would have been a huge step forward, but they were looking to see if they could produce the components needed to build cells, like amino acids, lipids, carbohydrates, things like that. So if you are more interested in this or confused, this is a nice link to go back and look at, and it will explain this Miller and Urey experiment more clearly to you. Now, this experiment has been done many times since then, and what Miller and Urey found were not cells. Again, that's not what they were looking for, but they did find organic compounds, particularly amino acids, those components needed to build proteins. Now, scientists do agree that before you can have life, you need a cell, and those chemical reactions need to be taking place inside the cell, which can then replicate itself. So experiments have later shown that polypeptides and, remember, phospholipids, those particular little fat molecules with the phosphate head and the two fatty acid tails, those are phospholipids. And polypeptides, poly means many, peptides are the bonds between amino acids. So these are proteins. Now we can have protein and lipid combinations that can join to form these fluid-filled spheres. That's tough to say. And if you have this happening in the ocean, and this happens to come around some important chemical reactions, you could begin to get the components of the first cells. And that is how the theory goes. Later, we have a guy named Juan Oro, and he showed again that these amino acids could be made from the chemicals on early Earth, and he was able to form adenine, which is a super important nitrogenous base. Remember, adenine goes into DNA and RNA. So those are our nucleic acids, and nucleic acids are the molecules that store our genetic information. So without these nitrogenous bases like this, we wouldn't have a code to pass life on. Now, we've seen Francis Crick's name before. Remember Watson and Crick, the Nobel Prize winners for determining the structure of DNA, with Maurice Wilkins there at the end as well. Now, Francis Crick was also involved in his own work. He experimented with RNA as well. So not just this double helix of DNA, but this single strand of nucleic acids known as RNA. And there are three types of RNA: mRNA, or messenger RNA, which carries your information to build a protein from the nucleus to the ribosome. We have tRNA that transfers the amino acids to the ribosome in the correct order based on that mRNA sequence. And then we have rRNA, or ribosomal RNA, which builds up part of the ribosome. And some of this RNA can actually work as an enzyme. Remember that enzymes perform chemical reactions for the cell. So we have this very primitive molecule here that scientists believe probably evolved before DNA because it is less stable and it does have more function than DNA. So it would have been more functional in an early life form. Later on, DNA could have evolved to stabilize this genetic code and be protected. So remember that RNA is made every time you need a protein. DNA is not. It's only made once when the cell replicates. And so that DNA is a more permanent hold to that genetic code. Now, many scientists disagree that life started this way, and perhaps you do as well, where no one's trying to change your beliefs here. We're just trying to show you what evidence we have on our planet and other planets. So please think of evolution as a science that can be tested, whereas what you may believe, your faiths, are things that you can't test. Those are just things you believe, and we don't need evidence to support what you have faith in. So many scientists do disagree that life began in this way, and some scientists even think life came here from other worlds. We have signatures of amino acids and other organic compounds on foreign planets as well, and asteroids that have come into our planet and been found and tested have also contained some of these organic compounds needed for life. So if we consider what the planet looked like millions of years ago, our first organisms needed to be able to survive it, which would have been tricky. So we believe that anaerobic prokaryotes were probably the first beings on the planet and probably used chemosynthesis instead of photosynthesis around these hydrothermal vents. We'll look at that more here in just a few minutes. But remember, an means without and aero means air. So these work without oxygen. They do not need oxygen in order to survive and break down organic components. Prokaryotes are also very simple cells, and you would imagine that you get more complex over time as you gain these new structures to be passed on to offspring. Next, we would have gotten our photosynthetic prokaryotes. Sorry, that appears to have gotten cut off a little bit, but photosynthesis would have been needed next to build that oxygen in the atmosphere to support our first eukaryotes that did need that oxygen to break down organic components. So unicellular eukaryotes, we start to get that complexity, that those extra organelles and organization within the cell so that it can function even better and more efficiently. And then our multicellular eukaryotes, things that you can see with your naked eye, are plants and animals. And some of your fungi and some of your protists are multicellular eukaryotes. And again, you're adding complexity to the body, more efficiency, because things begin to get more specialized in what they do for the body. And those specialized structures would have helped an organism survive and would have been passed on. So this is the idea of a general idea of how things progressed on the planet. Some of our key evidence for evolution and the progression of life comes in the form of fossils or remains of organisms that lived many, many years ago. So in order for a fossil to form, the organism had to be buried quickly under a layer of sediment. This is usually going to happen in the water. And that's going to put pressure on this organism, but it's also going to preserve it because things can't get to it to tear it apart. Not just the atmosphere, not just the weather patterns, but other organisms aren't going to get down there and scavenge pieces of it and spread it out. So it's very tricky to have a fossil to form. So once this organism is buried, the minerals that are moving through the water, that are being picked up by the water, replace bits and pieces of this organism over time. So it breaks down very slowly, and we get a cast of the organism replaced by minerals. So this is evidence that these organisms lived a long time ago on our planet, and we can see how their body shapes have changed. Our first fossil evidence are in these bacterial mats that we have dated to be on the planet 3.5 billion years ago. So about a billion years after the planet started to form and cool. Most scientists, again, agree that life probably began around these hydrothermal vents, your anaerobic prokaryotes that could not use oxygen. Were down here hanging out around these underwater volcanoes. So there's a lot of sulfur coming out of this smoke cloud that you're seeing. And there are certain bacteria that can take the electrons off of that sulfur and use it during chemosynthesis, similar to how plants rip electrons off of water and use them during photosynthesis. You can go back and review that if you need to. But these chemosynthetic bacteria around these hydrothermal vents would have made sense to be the first organisms on our planet. Remember our photosynthetic prokaryotes, probably what we had arriving next. We had these chemosynthetic bacteria that could already process energy in some way. So slight mutations to that, they stopped using the energy from the volcanic matter coming out of the earth and start using sunlight, which was probably more readily available and more widespread available on our planet as it started to cool. So photosynthesis appears to have become common about 3 billion years ago on our planet in shallow parts of the ocean. And as this photosynthesis was going on, we we're also creating oxygen. So oxygen starts to build up, not only in the water, but it's going to leach out of the water into the atmosphere. So think about early Earth. We have all these metallic elements coming out from these rocks, and oxygen rusts metal. So in the rock layers that are about 3 billion years old, we see this rust layer where the oxygen is starting to come out of these photosynthetic creatures and bind with the metals and things that were in the water at the time, and we get that rust settling to the bottom. And that's something we see all over the planet around 3 billion years ago. So these photosynthetic prokaryotes would not have had a chloroplast, which is the organelle that eukaryotes use, plants use for photosynthesis, but they would have had the pigment chlorophyll. And chlorophyll can do the same thing. So these little prokaryotes did have the most important thing they needed for photosynthesis, which again takes carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight, three things readily available on early Earth, and converts those into glucose, carbohydrates, and then oxygen. So that carbohydrate is where that sunlight's energy is being converted, what it's going to be stored in. So these cyanobacteria, these little photosynthetic prokaryotes, are still where most of the oxygen on this planet comes from today. But they were all we had about 3 billion years ago. So they're starting to pump the atmosphere full of oxygen. But remember that a lot of that oxygen is going into bonding with these metallic elements and falling back into the oceans as rust. So it took a while to start getting it to come out of the ocean and build up in the atmosphere, about 1.2 billion years. So after about 1.8 billion years ago, that's about 1.2 billion years after photosynthesis began, we started to get this buildup of oxygen, which made more complex organisms possible that could have a mitochondria that could use aerobic respiration. Now, many primitive organisms were actually poisoned by oxygen, so they died out. And oxygen building up in the planet began being used for cellular respiration as that had evolved in bacteria. So cellular respiration, you're using oxygen to break down glucose. We mentioned the endosymbiont theory or the endosymbiotic theory a little bit before. Remember, endo means inside, sym means together, and bio means life. So we have living things taking something in and working together with it. So prokaryotes had no organelles, no nucleus, no other organelles either, just very simple cells, DNA in the cytoplasm, some ribosomes, cell membrane, cell walls, and that's about it. Now, the mitochondria and the chloroplast, two very important organelles for energy processing, are assumed to have their origins in prokaryotes. There were photosynthetic prokaryotes, so we have already talked about those cyanobacteria and many species of those. We also had organisms, little bacteria that are able to use those carbohydrates produced by photosynthesis and break those down and get their energy from them in the presence of oxygen. So we have the beginnings of the mitochondria and the chloroplast as prokaryotes living outside of the cell. Now, once these predatory cells take in these little bacteria that act like mitochondria and chloroplast, perhaps there's a relationship that forms. They don't get digested like the cell might have intended to do, but there's a mistake and they don't. So this mitochondria continues to crank out ATP for the cell, just like this bacteria is going to do normally. And this chloroplast can take in sunlight for photosynthesis, and the cell sees these as useful and keeps them around. Cells that do not digest these two organelles have a better chance of survival because they're more efficient and they pass this trait on. So we assume that the mitochondria was taken in first because both plants and animals have the mitochondria, and then the chloroplast could have been taken on by a certain group of these cells that contain the mitochondria and diverged on into our plants. So that is the endosymbiotic theory, and these two organelles, there's a lot that supports it. They both have two membranes. They both have their own DNA. They work independently of the cell. They're the same size as bacteria, and their ribosomes that they make are similar to what bacteria make, more so than what eukaryotes make. So lots of evidence to support this endosymbiotic relationships when it comes to cells. So there's just another way to look at endosymbiosis. We have the ancestral cell. Using phagocytosis, wrapping this membrane around this bacteria, bringing it into the cell. It's wrapping it in one membrane, and then it's got its own membrane, so therefore you have two membranes. And both the chloroplast and mitochondria have those two membranes. Again, they have their own DNA in there. Ribosomes similar size to the bacteria. So we see the mitochondria being taken into the cell, and then this cell just doesn't digest it. So they start to live together. Later on, we have the same thing that could have happened to the chloroplast to give us our plant cells. So you have just another way of viewing that. So early eukaryotes appeared on the planet about 2 billion years ago, and we get this from mathematical data and mutations and how quickly they happen and just doing calculations and seeing how long ago eukaryotes could have been formed. These don't very easily preserve in fossils. Um, but we assume around 2 billion years ago. They included algae. Remember that in endosymbiosis, we have these little chloroplasts that are forming from these cyanobacteria living in the ocean. So we start to add complexity to our cells. Sexual reproduction, we get about 1.2 billion years ago in eukaryotes, and this increased the rate of change. Remember, you're swapping DNA between two organisms. This allows for more genetic variation in our changing planet, and those changes could have helped organisms survive and reproduce, pass those traits on. We don't see our first multicellular organisms until about 580 million years ago, and this starts with algae mostly that we see in the water. Most life on this planet evolved during the Cambrian explosion. This was about 540 million years ago. And here we start to get every group of animal and plant that we still have around today. Even some phylums that were lost completely that we had around then. So remember our classification system: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So phylum is right under kingdom. That's a pretty big group to have been completely wiped out. So after the Cambrian explosion, we had a mass extinction and lots of organisms were wiped out. Plants started living on land about 480 million years ago. This was a major source of oxygen being added again to the environment. And it appears that plants colonized land before animals did. And we'll try to look more at those steps a little bit later. And the atmosphere began to stabilize with oxygen and carbon dioxide around 350 million years ago. And it's remained about the same ever since. So there have been 5 mass extinctions on our planet, one before the Cambrian explosion during the Great Oxygenation Event. So when all this oxygen was building up on the planet, remember I mentioned it killed off the things that were intolerant to it. And then 4 since the Cambrian explosion, mostly due to climate change. And we all know the one that killed off the dinosaurs was due to an asteroid, which again greatly changed the climate. So we are now in the 6th mass extinction. It's called the Anthropocene period now because humans have had such great influence on our environment. And it is said that we are killing out organisms and species at alarming rates. So we are very much possibly into the 6th mass extinction on our planet. And we'll try to look more at those a little bit later. So remember that the carbon and oxygen cycles relate to each other. Photosynthesis absorbs carbon dioxide and releases oxygen, and cellular respiration does the opposite. It absorbs oxygen and releases carbon dioxide, and both of those cycles are going to feed on each other. Photosynthesis, we have the equation right here. We have carbon dioxide and water coming together in the presence of light, and that light energy is then going to be converted into carbohydrates, into glucose particularly, and oxygen. Cellular respiration is the opposite of this. We are going to use oxygen to break down that glucose, and that's going to generate carbon dioxide and water as byproducts. The goal again is to make ATP, which is the cell's energy currency. So those are your equations and those are those processes. And kind of go back, review where they came from. And evolution is simply change over time. So we're going to get into this a little more and more throughout the week. Have a great day, guys. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll talk more about evolution later. Bye-bye.